Hello, everyone. Welcome to yours and my favorite part of the week. That's right, it's developmental psychology. And I'm your host, and I'm here to walk you through language and education. Very exciting. So let's jump right into it. Let's begin with the basic components of language and kind of a definition of language. And language is a common system in which a limited number of signals can be combined according to agreed upon rules to produce an infinite number of messages. Linguists have not yet fully described the rules for more than 6,000 languages that exist. Phonemes are basic units of sound that can change the meaning of a word. Languages also specify how phonemes can be combined. There are probably about 100 in total, and each language only uses a subset ranging from 15 to 60. Morphemes, basic units of meaning that exist in a word, can be full words such as dog, or modifiers / affixes such as re or ish. Recall, redo, for example, refers to do it again, and pink-ish kind of refers to kind of, and moderately so. So just some basic definitions to begin with. And continuing on with our basic definitions, syntax, which is the systematic rules for forming sentences, Fang, Fred, bit versus Fred, bit, Fang. So it's just kind of general rules, in this case of English. Understanding the meanings of sentences requires knowing the semantics, that is moved beyond literal meanings. A meaning is derived from words in sentences, such as Sherry was green with jealousy. Pragmatics, which is rules for specifying how language is used appropriately in different social contexts. And prosody, how the sounds are produced. Melody of speech, because it includes pitch or intonation, can use the same word to mean different things. Dog versus dog. So, like I said before, for semantics, the idea here is that you need to understand the meanings of or understanding the meanings of sentence requires semantics, because sentences and the meanings of sentences, I should say, are not literal. So in this example, Sherry was green with jealousy. Sherry most likely is not an alien. However, she is jealous. And we understand this because we do not read and interpret words in only their literal sense. And I wanted also to highlight prosody. So using the same word to mean different things. So the idea here is a child saying the word dog. So, for example, a child saying dog, that could be thought to be describing a particular four-legged animal as a dog, or just pointing to a dog, versus dog, which could which refers to a question. So, is this a dog? Where is my dog? Etc. So, the same word producing different meanings depending on the pitch of the word used. Neurocomponents of language. And this is kind of just a very basic overview of the neurocomponents of language. It's far more complex than this, and this is not exactly correct, but for the purpose of this class, this is sufficient. The left hemisphere of the brain shows increased neural activity when listening to speech, and Broca's area is associated with speech production. Wernicke's area is associated with comprehension with language. The right hemisphere shows increased neural activity when processing speech. Theories of language, nature and nurture. Nativist / nurture theory suggests that children are born with some basic knowledge about how language works. A key component of this is universal grammar, which is a system of common rules and properties for learning any of the world's languages. 75% of languages have the basic word order, which is subject, verb, object, or subject, object, verb. Chomsky's language acquisition device. This is a hypothetical organ in the brain in which nativists believe functions to sift through language, apply universal rules, and specialize the system to the specifics of the language spoken in an environment. So kind of the idea here is that there's these literal universal principles of grammar that kind of allows for humans who are born not knowing a language, obviously, to kind of easily or more easily acquire language through development, because despite there being hundreds of languages, because all languages share kind of similar rules and properties. And Chomsky's language acquisition device is kind of this hypothetical, or again, it's probably more appropriately to say a kind of system in the brain that sifts through languages and applies universal rules during development, which allows for the specialization of the neurological specialization reflecting the language spoken in their neighborhood. So basically the idea here is this English is being spoken in your neighborhood, your house, and among your family members primarily. Then this hypothetical neurological system is able to apply universal rules that will apply to all languages. So kind of this biological innate system applying universal rules, sifting through the language, and then ultimately specializing their kind of neurological language systems to recognize and produce the English language. Poverty of the stimulus. This is a nativist argument. And what they argue is that children could not acquire such complex communication systems with the limited linguistic input they receive. Environmental stimulus of language input is too impoverished to support the linguistic output that we see emerge. Children typically progress through the same sequences at roughly similar ages and make similar errors, which suggests a species-wide maturational plan. Young children learn native language at ease, but struggle to learn a second language in later life. So kind of the idea here is, again, this is a nurture argument. This is a biological innate process or a species-wide maturation plan. And the idea and evidence for this is that when children are learning languages, they simply do not receive enough linguistic input to produce the complex communication that they're capable of. For example, parents do not sit around and read the dictionary to the child, and that would not even be truly reflect the complexity of language anyway, because you can make infinite sentences, for example. So the idea here is that there's just simply no way that there are enough environmental inputs to kind of reinforce the acquisition of language. So this kind of gets back to Skinner versus a classic Skinner versus Chomsky beef, where if you recall from Skinner, kind of this idea that you're constantly reinforcing things and that's how you learn. Well, kind of the poverty of the stimulus is that the stimulus is too impoverished to reinforce language, and rather there's this natural nature-based species-wide maturation plan that allows for language acquisition. And further evidence is that children typically learn languages around similar ages and make similar errors at particular ages, which again suggests that there is this species-wide developmental trajectory. Moving on to nurture/environmental influences on language, children learn the words they hear spoken by others. They have accents and are more likely to start using new words if they are encouraged to ask questions, make requests, and make conversation. These theorists have an easier time explaining the development of phonology and semantics than accounting for how rules of syntax are acquired. So kind of the idea here is that we understand that there are environmental influences on language. Otherwise, children would not have this similar accents as their parents, or similar accents as people that they interact with in their community. Children also learn words that they hear spoken by others. So if you're cursing all the time, you might hear your kid randomly yell like shit or whatever. And that kind of just, again, evidence that environmental influence play a role in language. But nurture arguments have an easier time when making arguments dealing with semantics, so kind of understanding the meaning of sentence. And phonology was kind of like a study of sounds rather than how rules of syntax are acquired, because rules of syntax, children start speaking, I should say, prior to understanding the rules of syntax. Even at a basic kindergarten level, children are speaking before that, and children are speaking and writing far earlier than kind of formal education of English. Thus, again, kind of suggesting this species-wide maturation plan, but with specific environmental influences, and kind of trying to tease that apart is difficult. Next, an interactionist perspective. Children's biological-based competencies in language environment interact to shape course of language development. Cognitive development paves the way for progress in language development. As adults converse with young children, they create supportive learning environments, scaffold, that helps the children grasp the regularities of language, and they use conversations to improve communications. Child-directed speech occurs within a dynamic social context that helps infants understand why language is used to share ideas and communicate within a social group. So kind of the idea here, again, is kind of this interactionist. It's an interaction between nature and nurture. And children have particular biological-based competencies which interact with the language environments to shape the course of their language development. And one example is kind of this idea that, or they argue that as cognitive development occurs within a particular child, this kind of opens up more capabilities to acquire languages. So it kind of paves the road for language acquisition, or language development more specifically. And further evidence of environmental influences on language development is that as environments and caregivers provide supportive learning environments through scaffolding, for example, that allows a child to practice their language skills, which improves language development and communication more generally. And one example is child-directed speech, which allows, which is kind of like a process wherein a parent will request a child to look at something in particular and maybe label it and just kind of have a conversation about things they're observing. But we're going to get more into the specifics of that and particular components of child-directed speech in the upcoming slides. Infants mastering language. Newborns show preference for speech over non-speech sounds. Word segmentation, ability to detect a target word in a stream of speech. Demonstrated by 7.5 months, come to understand that cat must represent a unit that is separate from other spoken units. Cooing, which is repeating vowel-like sounds, 6 to 8 weeks of age, and content or in response to a parent's happy voice. So kind of the idea here is that infants and humans in general show a preference for speech-related sounds. This kind of gets back to this idea that some researchers argue that humans are an ultra-social species, wherein we, just prefer interacting with others. It's necessary to our development, or for successful developmental outcomes. And one example is again infants showing a preference for speech over non-speech sounds. So an idea of specific communication by a human. By 7.5 months of age, infants demonstrate an ability to understand that when a sentence is being spoke to them, each one of those words represents kind of a thing, a unit that is separate from other spoken units. And cooing is repeating vowel-like sounds, which just kind of expresses a content-like state in response to being content or parents interacting with them. So this is kind of pre-word formation and a method by which infants are able to communicate with their caregivers. Continuing on with babbling, repeating consonant vowel combinations such as baba, 4 to 6 months of age, and comprehension before production in language development. 8-month-old babies babble with an accent, restrict babbling sounds to phonemes in the language they hear. So kind of the idea here is that similar to cooing, but now we have consonant and vowel combinations, and doing so repeatedly, specific consonant vowel combinations. And children, and infants in particular, are able to understand language before they're able to produce language. And again, kind of owing to the environmental influences on language, 8-month-old babies will babble with an accent, and they restrict their babbling sounds to, or their babbling to sounds found specifically in their caregiver's native language, or the language that's being spoken to the child, I should say. So kind of like you see the specialization of there's neurological specialization of reflecting the language spoken within a household and or neighborhood. And this just be an example where the child begins to only babble in particular sounds related to their caregiver's language. And kind of the point here is that over time, you originally begin with kind of this generalized brain capable of acquiring any language, but over time, when you're interacting with your a particular language, we'll just say English for keep it simple, of the English language of your caregivers, your brain specializes to produce and comprehend only those sounds found within that particular language. Next, I want to talk about American Sign Language, because even though it's called language, often people do not conceptualize sign language as a language, but it is. It has all the properties of language, and the same principles of language acquisition applies to sign language, and specifically we're looking here at American Sign Language. There's different sign languages throughout the world, obviously, kind of the American qualifier in front of sign languages, but just something to keep in mind. So, like other languages, the earlier the better applies. Mastery of the syntax and semantics of sign language was greatest among students exposed to it in infancy and early childhood. Those who learn ASL later in their development, ages 9 to 16, mastered it better if they had some exposure to English early in life than if they had not been exposed to any language system before. Deaf infants whose parents are deaf babble in sign language. Deaf parents communicate using child-directed signs. So kind of the idea here, just like other languages, is that language development begins, some researchers argue prenatally. So the idea here is that the quicker you expose deaf children to language that allows them to communicate with their parents, the more mastery of syntax and semantics they will develop. And so the earlier, the better, like all languages. And exposure to any language is beneficial to eventually mastering ASL later in life. So you can imagine a deaf baby who may not have deaf parents, thus unable, and it'd say that they don't speak ASL, and therefore they're unable to communicate with their child, thus kind of depriving the child of language inputs and the opportunity to interact with their caregivers at the same frequency and at the same depth as other hearing babies. So kind of, again, the earlier the better, but also kind of any interactions with language as a child is beneficial because the absence of any language inputs is typically is associated with numerous negative developmental outputs, which again kind of just speaks to the importance of language acquisition. And it's important to note, as I stated, that deaf babies babble just like hearing babies, but they obviously will babble in the sign language and using kind of their own child-directed or child-produced sign language signs. Mastering language. At 12 months of age, infants begin to use social and linguistic cues to learn words. Joint attention is two people looking at the same thing. Infants listen to parents repeatedly labeling and pointing at the objects, directing their gaze, connecting words to their objects. The development of joint attention is associated with early vocabulary development. Syntactic bootstrapping is where a word is placed in a sentence to determine the meaning of the word. There's a furball versus there's furball. So this kind of gets back to that dynamics approach that we talked about earlier. In this example, parents use joint attention, wherein they will point to a particular object to make the child pay attention to that object, so kind of directing their gaze, and then saying the words that is associated, which is what that object is. That is a book, that is a cat, whatever. And kind of this practice is associated with kind of straightforwardly early vocabulary development, because you're identifying objects and you are applying vocabulary terms to those objects. You're labeling it for the child. And then our final point is just that where a word is placed in a sentence determines the meaning of the word. So there's a fur ball is, whatever, there's a fur ball on the floor versus there's fur ball, presumably a cat or a dog. So children around 12 months of age are able to make this distinction. Hollow phrases is a single word utterance used by an infant that represents an entire sentence worth of meaning. The same word can have multiple meanings. Getty means that is spaghetti, or I want spaghetti. Depends on the way the word is said and the context in which it's said. Infants' first words spoken around 1 year of age. The first 50 words consist of common nouns representing objects and people. Maybe because nouns are easier an image of, or because parents tend to use more nouns in conversations with children. So kind of the idea here is that an infant is able to say one particular word, and that can have multiple meanings, and parents are typically able to discern what the child is meaning based on the context in which the word is said. In Western settings, the first 50 words are typically common nouns representing objects or people, which is fine, but it should be noted that cross-culturally this is not always replicated. Many East Asian countries do not have this same association, but it's fine for the purposes of kind of this Western-focused development of language. Vocabulary spur. This is a pace of word learning quickens dramatically at about 18 months of age. This is hypothesized to increase children's words from 50 words at 18 months to 150 words at 20 months to 300 words at 24 months. So you see this rapid increase in word knowledge at beginning around 18 months of age. Fast mapping is the capacity of young language learners to readily determine the object or other reference of a word and then remember this for future encounters with the word, aka use sentence context to help make an educated guess about the word's meaning. So kind of just the basic idea here is that children are increasingly able to understand the what is being applied through by a particular word that they may or may not know through analyzing the sentence context, which allows them to make educated guesses about the word's meaning. So this kind of gets back to semantic knowledge, increasing understanding that Julie is not actually green with jealousy, but they're able to piecemeal make an educated guess based on the sentence context, and also because they're learning so many new words. So, and parents are obviously going to, and typically in Western settings, limit the amount of vocabulary they're using and limit their sentence structure, which allows infants to interact with particular sets of words more frequently, and thus kind of are able to make better educated guesses about other words found in the sentence that's spoken by a parent. So that can kind of just be an example like a scaffolding. So you can say a sentence where almost a child knows 90% of the words and then is able to piece together that final 10% of the words to make a reasonable educated guess at what the words mean. Okay, so let's talk about when infant language fails. The first example is overextension, which is a child uses a word to refer to too wide a range of objects or events. A child uses the word doggy to refer to all four-legged animals. A child may overextend the meaning of words because they want to communicate, but we only have a small vocabulary to do so. Versus underextension, which child uses a word to refer only to their object or event. A child uses the word doggy to refer only to basset hounds, like the family pet. Getting semantics correct hypothesized to be mainly a matter of discriminating similarities and differences, categorizing animals by size, shape, and sounds. So as I stated, overextension kind of refers to applying a particular example that a child learns to all future examples. So kind of in the example laid out in the bullet point, a child is told by their parent that this particular four-legged animal is a dog, and an overextension error occurs when a child will see any four-legged animal, a cow, for example, and then call that a dog. They're overextending the meaning of words to animals that are not dogs. Versus underextension, where a child is told that their dog is dog, and what a child will do is when they underextend, they will believe that the word dog only refers to their particular dog. So they'll see another dog walking across the street, and they would say, they wouldn't say, but whatever, they would conceptualize that other dog as not a dog because there's only one dog, and that is the dog within their house, which was originally labeled by their parents or however they acquired that label by interacting with their dog. And kind of the idea here is that children, or why this is occurring, one hypothesis is that a child may want to better label things, but they just don't have the vocabulary to do so. And also some researchers argue that getting semantics correctly is really just a matter of developing the cognitive capacities to correctly categorize animals by their size, shape, and sounds. So kind of this more elaborate categorization capabilities allows for a child to decrease overextension and underextension errors. Word gaps. A seminal study found that children from the wealthiest families heard more than 3 times the number of words per hour than poor children, 620 versus 2,000. They found that children who heard more words as they grew up entered their schools with larger vocabularies and higher IQ test scores. Follow-up research found that that the amount of quality speech children hear is important, not the quantity. Infants heard more child-directed speech produce more words. So this is a kind of a seminal study, and like every seminal study, there's always years later, people realize, oh wait, maybe this isn't replicable, or maybe there's an incorrect interpretation, or maybe it's this other variable. So kind of the idea here was, okay, the issue with differences between poor families and rich families, and consequently racial minorities and white families as well. So you have that class and race distinction is that parents are just talking more to their child, and that creates a word gap per hour, and this word gap is associated with IQ and knowing more words, and consequently all these life outcomes. Well, what follow-up research found that it really is not the quantity of words, but rather the quality of words, and parents interacting with their child that allows for greater productions of vocabulary, or greater acquisitions of larger vocabulary. And as we talked about in the previous chapter, IQ is associated with all kinds of environmental factors, such as race, and which is wrapped up in a class. So environmental poverty being associated with lower IQs over time, even if individuals start off with the same IQ. So trying to make one large claim that really what's driving IQ differences is a word gap is kind of a big reach, because as we talked about, there's all these other environmental factors from chronic stress, overcrowding, parenting, about poverty, violence in your neighborhood, etc., being exposed to war, natural disasters. But even besides that fact, subsequent research has found, like I stated, that really it's about the quality of speech and kind of children interacting with their parents that allows for greater levels of vocabulary. And going back to examples of a poor family, so for example, parents would obviously have less opportunities to interact with a child and have less opportunities and kind of less really energy to interact with their child in high quality ways because they have all these other stressors going on. Maybe they're working multiple jobs, they're stressed out about finances, maybe they have depression or whatever factors are weighing them down in life, interfering with the quality of parent-child interactions or caregiver-child interactions, thus increasing the word gap and lowering IQ test scores. And that's just kind of an example of a unmeasured third variable mediating or kind of being behind the association between two variables that were measured. It's often this unmeasured third variable that researchers don't think about that is actually driving the association between the two variables that we're interested in. Moving on to telegraphic speech. This occurs between 18 to 24 months of age on average. It's an early combination of 2, 3, or more words. They contain critical content words, no want, for example. Functional grammar emphasizes a semantic relationship among words, the meanings being expressed, and the functions served by sentences. So as I stated, now that we're a little older, we can say more than one word. We can say no want. We can say no spaghetti instead of just saying spaghetti. And this is kind of globally called functional grammar, where which emphasizes the semantic relationship among words and the meanings being expressed. So kind of idea here is our grammar is being defined by how functional it is. So no want is functional because it's conveying a particular meaning within that fragment of a sentence. Mastery motivation. A striving for mastery or competency is thought to be universal. However, it flourishes in responsive environments with plenty of opportunities to see for themselves they can control their environments and experience success. Depression in parents are at risk of providing less responsive parenting, which negatively impacts development of mastery or mastery development motivation. Mastery behavior at 12 months predicts mental development at 3 years of age. So kind of the idea here is that this mastery motivation is thought to be universal, but when parents or caregivers or environments more generally provide multiple opportunities for the child to demonstrate that they can control their immediate environment or at least control successful outcomes within particular tasks that they're doing, that allows a child to not get discouraged and understand that through kind of like effort, hard work, they can experience success. And like everything, depression in parents restricts the quality of parenting. And in this particular example, less responsive parenting. So kind of going back to this idea where a child fails at a particular task, and a parent is responsive and kind of explains, okay, you failed, but really what we're looking to do here is kind of learn how through over time persevere and continue on. And it's really this process of learning that is important. And through that process of learning, you can master skills. And this mastery behavior is associated with future developmental outcomes. Next, we're going to pivot to early education. Researchers dispute the idea that typically developing children raised in a typical family environment need direct instruction during the first 3 years of life. kind of these baby Einstein programs, which may not give children enough time to play or socialize as they choose, which are important activities for development. Studies of babies watching educational videos. For each hour spent watching videos, babies understand 6 to 8 fewer words. Studies on educational preschool programs with a strong academic commitment, initial advantage in basic academic skills, but are less creative, more anxious in testing situations, and more negative toward school than social-oriented preschool. So kind of the idea here is that parents are kind of obsessed with making their child the next baby Einstein, and designing every aspect, or regimenting every aspect of their day, so their child ends up to be a genius, because everything is kind of this like cutthroat competition, wherein you have to reach X university setting, because that's where particular resources are allocated based on that social class, and kind of the prestige associated with being in that social class. So parents will kind of obsessively, or some parents I should say, obsessively regiment their infants' days to such an extent that every second has to be kind of this educational opportunity, and thus there's this whole market of apps and programs that claim that they are capable of setting this lifelong developmental trajectory of success by becoming very super intelligent at a young age. However, this has not been found in research. And in fact, as we've spoken on previous chapters, play is incredibly important for children's development. And that's playing with others, and imaginary play, and kind of just free play in general is very important for developmental outcomes. So ironically, parents may be stripping children with those opportunities to form social bonds and develop other skills needed to function in their daily lives, and which are actually important to educational outcomes in themselves. Studies have found that babies who watch educational videos, I should say some studies have found, that not only do they not form or increase their vocabulary, but they actually lose vocabulary over time through watching TV. And preschools which kind of emphasize strong academic commitments over social play and kind of free play and more of a creative environment tend to produce children who do have an initial advantage in some basic academic skills, but they are less creative and more anxious in testing situations, and are more negative towards school than school-oriented preschools. So kind of the idea here is that over time, although children may be picking up particular skills, they are really just being drilled to memorize and be good at particular skills. So that kind of decreases creativity and can make them more anxious because they're so hyper-focused on performing well on task instead of allowing for socialization opportunities and kind of free play and explore their own intrinsic desires. And that actually can produce not just more anxiety, but more negativity associated with school because it's associated with so much stress. And there's an interesting book that I include here, and called The Price of Privilege: How Parental Pressure and Material Advantage Are Creating a Generation of Discontent and Unhappy Kids. And kind of the idea here is that this focus, this hyper-focus on achievement of striving, makes children, like I stated, less creative, but also more anxious and actually more kind of negative towards school because it's so challenging and no longer associated with the process of learning, but rather kind of the process of just earning a particular grade or succeeding on a particular test. So kind of stripping the joy of learning because there are different goals to education in these circumstances. And we're gonna get into that more as we go through this PowerPoint. Preschool programs that offer a healthy mix of play and academic activities can be beneficial. We're looking at 2 projects. The first, which I'm not going to attempt to say, but let's give it a shot. We'll go with Abacadarian. Children showed cognitive gains during and after, completed more years of education than those in the comparison group, And the Milwaukee Project, which is a full child care was provided for children along with job and education for parents, and 8th graders who participated scored higher on tests than those who didn't. So these are two famous projects, despite one of them being kind of difficult to pronounce. And the idea here is that children are not only giving opportunity to learn basic academic skills, but also provide a healthy mix of play, but also that they provide parents with the opportunity, in particular the Milwaukee study, for parents to continue their education and have job opportunities. And more generally, as the final bullet point states, programs which address poverty have the greatest success. So in psychology, we often think about anytime an intervention is asked, oh, what do we do? And everybody always starts with, particular interactions within the household. That's the most effective. But what studies have found, and I hope throughout this course you have greater appreciation for, is that these larger systems, these macro systems, these mesosystems, as Bronfenbrenner put it, of poverty, of economics and politics, has impacts those parent-child relationships, or caregiver-child relationships, or neighborhood-child relationships, or I should include child-school relationships. So because our environmental context affects us, and it's not just the environmental context of the home, but rather these larger structural and, in the words of Bronfenbrenner, systems shape the developmental context and put restrictions on the developmental context, and thus the developmental outcomes which are possible, on a speaking of probabilities, that is, within a given context. And thus studies have found that addressing poverty has great success for children's educational outcomes because, just numerous examples why. Maybe they have free school lunch, which allows the child to concentrate and not be hungry during school. Or the parents now has stable income, which allows them to not be depressed, or lower their depressive symptoms or anxiety, which allows them to interact with their child in a more a higher quality way. They also maybe allows them to one, you can change a neighborhood, so there's less chronic stressors within a neighborhood, such as overcrowding or violence within the neighborhood, etc. So again, these kind of larger macro systems, in this case addressing poverty, changing the developmental trajectories of particular students within schools. Moving on to child's language and expanding language skills, in particular in children. And looking at middle childhood, it brings increased meta-linguistic awareness, which is a knowledge of the language as a system. Children who are better at meta-linguistic understand the concept of words and can define words. Children can distinguish between grammatically correct and incorrect sentences. Bilingual children have better meta-linguistic skills. Bilingual and multilingual infants remain sensitive to a wider range of sounds used in the language they hear, may experience a temporary delay in some developmental areas, but end up with more advantages than disadvantages. So briefly touching on the meta-linguistic point, it's kind of like metacognition, it's meta, so kind of a knowledge of language as a system, which allows children to distinguish between sentence fragments and correct fragments, or I should say correct sentences, and determine when sentences are grammatically correct or not grammatically correct. And we're going to get into more of the specifics of bilingualism children momentarily. So bilingualism alters the neural connections of the brain. When using one of their languages, it activates the other language at the same time. May relate to bilingual children/adults' enhanced abilities to switch between different tasks. Increased working memory and the ability to ignore irrelevant information and focus on a task. It strengthens the higher level executive control components of the cognitive system. And learning a second language later in life results in different changes in brain architecture, which suggests a second language learning may follow different paths depending on what age it occurs. So kind of an old trope and this incorrect assumption was that bilingual children and learning another language in general kind of is associated with these long-term developmental delays that kind of mess up a child's development, so thus don't do it. But that's not actually found in the literature. And to the extent that there are limited delays, children quickly catch up and over time experience many more gains than monolingual children. And these gains are reflected on a neurological level with particular brain activation when children speak one language versus another, which actually may be associated with an ability to be cognitively flexible. So kind of going back to the example from a previous chapter, when a child is asked to sort blue blocks into a blue bucket and yellow blocks into a yellow bucket, and then the experimenter says, okay, let's switch up the game. Now you sort the yellow blocks into the blue bucket and the blue blocks into the yellow bucket. Well, children struggle with that, right? It's called cognitive flexibility. Well, the idea here is because children are able to switch between speaking languages, and this is reflected again within their neurological activation patterns, that it may also be associated with greater cognitive flexibility in general. It also increases working memory and allows for greater ability to ignore irrelevant information. Kind of speaking to the species-wide maturational plan or kind of developmental trajectory of language, individuals who learn language early on in life as a child have different neurological activation patterns when speaking the language versus a person learning a language at 30 years old. So there's basically different neurological patterns of activation depending on when you learned the language, so 30 years old versus 1 year old, for example. And this, again, kind of reflects this idea that in the beginning of development, we have this general capacity to learn any language, but over time our brain becomes more specialized to our particular language, and this is reflective in the neurological activation patterns of individuals depending on when they initially learn that language. Getting back to achievement motivation, children's beliefs about their competence predicts their performance. Some researchers argue that it's not so much what you have that is your ability, your talent, and your intelligence, but how you think about what you have. A fixed mindset, individuals believe their abilities and talent are fixed or static. You have a talent or you don't. There's little reason to put forth great effort on a task, versus a growth mindset, which believes that abilities and talents are malleable, motivated to put forth effort, and fostered by praising students' effort/process, not the end product. So kind of the idea here is that if a child, you can imagine a child struggling with a particular task, and that child has a fixed mindset, for example. Well, if you believe that your talent is innate, that you can't change it, then why try more? You're just wasting your time by definition, because there's no way to get better at something, right? Versus a growth mindset, so if you struggle with something and you believe that talents and abilities are malleable, then you'll put in greater effort. And one way that parents can encourage a growth mindset is to focus on a student's or their child's efforts in the process, not the end product. So this again kind of goes back to what we talked about before with the anxiety associated with children being admitted in schools that only focus on academic achievement. So they are actually focusing really just on that end product, that final grade, and not the process of learning. Not kind of this growth mindset, which is associated with, in that study of, in particular, kind of negativity towards school and anxiety in general in testing situations. Children also contribute to their achievement motivations. Before age 7, children are unrealistic optimists. They get better at evaluating as they age, and they understand feedback better. Young children may give up if their failures are clear-cut, and they conclude that they are bad or equate success with being a good or bad person. So kind of the idea here is that children before 7 are thought to be just unrealistic optimists. They're going to be the best at everything. Hey, you want to drive the car? Yeah, let's do it. Let's go drive the car, even though they have no ability to do so. And one hypothesized reason why they get better at, or more realistic evaluations of themselves, is that they are better able to understand feedback. Young children also may give up after following a failure if they equate failure on a particular task with being a bad person. So I don't want to be reminded I'm a bad person, so I'm going to stop participating in this task and stop trying. So it's kind of similar to this fixed mindset, that in this case, though, and rather their abilities being static or fixed or innate, it's really like their quality as a person, or in this case, being a bad person. Learning goals. Believing that abilities are changeable, are changeable qualities, and improvement abilities can be improved with work protects children from damaging self-perceptions about failure, encourages to adopt mastery goals. Growth mindset, aiming to learn new things so that they can improve their abilities. In the U.S., as children age, they see ability as a fixed trait, adopt performance goals. They aim to prove their ability rather than to improve it, and seek to be judged smart rather than dumb. So, like we were getting at before, this idea that abilities and talents are fixed, are innate, static, can be harmful to a child, because when everybody fails at something, and when a child fails, in this case, and they have a fixed mindset, then their self-perceptions can be negatively impacted. And having children, or encouraging particular values, such as the ability to change and improve your abilities, protects a child from those negative effects associated with failures, because failures then becomes really just a process of learning, right? You are emphasizing the learning process and not the end product necessarily. And learning is thus a process. It's changeable, it's malleable, and you can get better with time. And interestingly, in the U.S., as children age, they see ability as a fixed trait, and they adopt more performance goals. So this is could be associated with a lot of things. So our schools emphasizing grades at all costs. It could be associated with standardized testing, but just in general, this idea that really what we're chasing here is this particular grade. I'm obsessed. I'm anxious about it. I have to get the good grade. I don't care about the process of learning and improving my abilities. It's just rather this final end product, and that is associated with a host of negative outcomes, which we'll cover more in future slides. And one reason that children, if you have this growth mindset, as I stated before, versus a growth mindset versus a fixed mindset of learning, is that if you fail at something, which you inevitably do, all it does is it demonstrates to you that you are dumb, because you can't change anything. So anytime you fail at something, you're just providing evidence that you're dumb, and that doesn't feel great. So you're going to want to avoid it and get away from that, and thus, try less and just avoid it really at all costs. Children with mastery/learning goals tend to do better in school than those who adopt fixed mindsets and switch to performance goals. The process of learning is enjoyable. It satisfies curiosity. They have higher levels of academic achievement. Children are focused on performance goals because the outcome, the grade, is the goal, not the process of learning. They report higher anxiety, which is negatively associated with achievement. Motivation and achievement is higher when children value a subject. They believe it is important, and they are interested in the subject. So ironically enough, as I stated, that focusing on the process of learning, and understanding that you can improve your abilities with time, and really you're not chasing this end product, but really just kind of appreciating learning and finding learning itself enjoyable, because it satisfies curiosity and allows you to be creative, is actually associated with higher academic achievement. So it may sound like, not focusing on grades means you're going to get worse grades, but that's not the case. And this is reflected in you can compare performance on various tasks across cultures, and the United States, despite the United States really hyper-focusing on grades, really is not meeting similar achievement levels as other cultures, which we'll get into in future slides. And as I stated before, when children focus on performance goals, that's all they're thinking about, the grade. They're obsessed with it. That's all that matters, is meeting this one performance goal. Thus, it kind of strips the joy of learning, and it makes you more anxiety, and higher anxiety is associated with worse achievements. And you can foster motivation and achievement in classrooms and as a caregiver because motivation and achievement is higher when children value a subject and they believe it's important and are interested in the subject. So kind of stressing the importance of it, but also channeling really those innate interests of children. So establishing and kind of figuring out what children are interested in, and then allowing them to kind of experiment with those interests, and not focus on achieving a particular grade. Increases mastery, motivation, and achievement. But also, if a particular subject is very important, really stressing the importance to a subject, learning that subject, and the process of learning in general, really, can make a child be more motivated to interact with that subject, because now they understand why it is important to their real world. It's not just some random bullshit we have to learn, but rather this has an impact on their daily lives in the immediate future and in the long-term future. Parents' contributions to motivation. Parents tend to hold mindsets about failure as either debilitating or enhancing. Children pick up parental mindsets about failure, and these help shape children's own mindsets about intelligence, providing a balance of structure for daily activities without holding unrealistic expectations, offering consistent and supportive, varies culturally, responses to children's activities and behaviors, and presenting opportunities for children to observe healthy responses to life's challenges from the adults in their lives. So kind of the idea here is that parents have particular views about failure, about growth versus fixed, mastery versus performance learning goals, and children pick up on that and they develop it themselves. So when parents provide consistent and supportive responses to children's activities and behaviors, and observe how parents or caregivers and families interact or respond to challenges within their life, helps shape the child's reactions to dealing with hardships within their lives. Now, why I say varies culturally is because some cultures provide more direct instructions than others, and some allow the child, in other cultures, I should say, allow higher and provide less direct and consistent support. So it's kind of a little more freedom, a little less direct demonstrations. So the degree of direct support and responding to particular children's behaviors varies by culture. So some cultures will respond every time a child does any behavior, some very rarely. But kind of the idea here in general is that the parents' mindsets about success and failures impacts their child's views on success and failures. So kind of straightforward. So I talked about kind of this global theoretical approach to American schools in particular, and the obsession with striving of every second being kind of this hyperfixation on performance goals. But let's look into some actual empirical studies. Well, one study told fifth graders in a classroom that they had low ability, and other group of fifth graders were told that they had high abilities. Half were given performance goals, that is, performance compared with other children evaluated by an expert, typical goals of a classroom, and half were given mastery goals. They were told that working on tasks sharpened the mind and helped them at school. Only children who became frustrated and gave up believed they had low ability and were in the performance goal group. Trying and failing over and over just reinforces they are stupid, not a great feeling. Low ability students who pursued mastery persisted despite failures. So this kind of gets back to what I discussed early on. And in this example here, the children were told that you have low ability. Half of the children were told you have low abilities, and half are told they have high abilities. And some children were given performance goals. That is, you perform well on this task, and then you're going to be evaluated by an expert. So kind of a typical classroom setting. You're given a test, and then or a teacher will evaluate you and see if you met the criteria, if you perform well on this task. So we're going to rate you. Versus a mastery goals, which were told, like, okay, the children were told, okay, you're going to get this task, and the goal of this task is really just kind of sharpen your mind, and eventually through time, this will help you perform better at school. What happened is, because this was a difficult task, children failed. And only the children, and the important part is that only the children who gave up belonged exclusively to the performance group and thought they had low ability. So it's that combination of saying, okay, you have low ability, which again gets back to that fixed mindset. It's this innate, unmovable ability that you have, in this case, low, and you're in a performance group. So what you're going for is grades. So you have low ability, and all that matters is getting good grades or whatever, performing well on this task. Those children in those groups were the only children to give up on the task. Because again, like I stated before, it's really just an example of a child saying, okay, well, I have low ability. Why do I want to keep performing this task? It's just telling me I suck. I don't want to deal with this. It feels bad, and I can't improve, so what's the point? While, interestingly, children who were classified as low ability but told that the task was really about mastery goals, again, those learning goals, and in this case, being told that this task will help you sharpen your mind and get better at school over time. So even though they were told they had low ability, those children that were giving mastery goals, they persisted despite their failure. So again, this kind of just speaks to how important the role of motivations within a school setting and a parent setting, but also at a country setting, in a country environment, impacts children's outcomes, in this case, educational outcomes, or giving up on this particular task. So again, getting back to this, again, that I want to stress throughout this course, is that these macro outcomes impact particular behaviors within a school setting in this example, but kind of in a more localized household setting as well. Studies suggest children are better off if teachers nurture intrinsic motivation to master challenges rather than performance goals. Motivated by internal goals, it allows children to view their mistakes as a sign to change strategies to improve competencies rather than prove they are done. Schools who offer lots of money for getting good grades do not produce improvements in standardized testing. Schools who offer less money and target behaviors that children can control could control and already perform reading, not grades. Okay, so kind of what we're talking about here is that teachers and kind of educational environments more generally that encourage intrinsic motivation. This idea that individuals have internal goals, and all individuals have internal goals, and all individuals have internal learning goals. So to foster those self-motivated goals, studies have shown is associated with better performance on particular tasks and educational outcomes more generally than educational settings that emphasize extrinsic motivation, which is being motivated for external reasons, but more specifically performance goals, that is grades. And again, this allows children to view their mistakes as a kind of a sign that they should change their strategies, and that changing their strategies and allows them to perform better in the future on this particular task. Now, interestingly, studies have found that when schools offer a lot of money for getting grades, it actually does not improve performance in standardized testing. So this kind of goes back this idea of Skinner, or like, and just in really general, like behavioralism, like quote unquote behavioralism. This is argues against that idea. because increasing rewards, money in this case, is not associated with greater improvements on standardized testing, but rather schools who offer less money and specifically targeted behaviors that a child can control and that they already participate in, such as reading, for example, was associated with higher outcomes on standardized testing. Not solely focusing on grades, but rather particular skills and behaviors that children can control, in this case, reading, and not just saying, get better grades or whatever. So again, the idea is schools that offered less money, not more money, and focusing on particular behaviors and letting the child know that by improving those particular behaviors, or through working on those particular behaviors, practicing those particular skills, in this case reading, you can gain better mastery over time, which has long-term benefits, versus just do this thing so you get a good grade. So jumping ahead a slide to kind of condense this lecture, learning to read. Emergent literacy is the developmental precursor of reading skills in young children. Includes knowledge, skills, and attitudes that facilitate the acquisition of reading. Children with greater working memory and attention have higher reading readiness. Parents who ask increasingly complex questions about the task can move their children from a superficial to a deeper understanding of the material. This is an example of a parent and child operating in the zone of proximal development. Rhyming stories and games can help foster phonological awareness, sensitivity to a sound system of language that enables them to segment spoken words into sounds. So kind of the idea of emergent literacy is that prior to children's ability to read, there's these other skills that are associated with reading, such as greater working memory and attention. So by improving those skills and particular attitudes, particular motivations, as we already discussed about, children can have higher levels of reading readiness. So kind of you're kind of priming the pump to be ready to read, whatever, perform well in reading tasks in school or just reading more generally. And one way that parents can increase children's understanding of not just words, but kind of just deeper understanding of material in general, is through asking complex questions about reading. So reading a book, and then a parent or a caregiver stopping and saying, "Okay, tell me what happened here. Can you describe this character? What's going on in this text?" So there's kind of this interaction, which increases the depth of understanding of a child about the material being read to them. And this is an example of a zone of proximal development. So kind of that Vygotsky idea, or in this case, Fisher building on this Vygotsky idea that children and everybody has a range of developmental possibilities, and particular scaffolding practices allow an individual, in this case a child, to reach their developmental potential. So by interacting with the text, by asking complex questions, which kind of encourages the child to think about the text in deeper ways, which increases understanding and kind of builds those emergent literacy skills. So again, skipping ahead a little bit, effective schools and effective learning. Academic achievement on average tends to be higher in schools with economically advantaged students. Children are better able to make academic progress in school when their homes have computers, books, and intellectual stimulating toys. Effective classrooms and emphasize academics, which is they demand a lot from students and expect them to succeed and work hard to achieve classroom objectives. They're task-oriented but comfortable atmosphere, manage discipline problems effectively, and foster an atmosphere of social cohesion so everyone feels they have a stake in the group and success. So kind of idea here is that on average, higher schools perform better when they have economically richer children, higher class children, and that's due to the obvious reasons. Those children come from wealthier homes, have more educational resources at home, have more opportunities for tutoring, for example, or just interacting, and opportunities for a caregiver and a child to interact with each other in complex ways that increases school readiness and the development of various cognitive processes associated with educational outcomes. And it kind of goes back to those Milwaukee project, wherein addressing poverty, in that case, through educational and job training possibilities, but you can even imagine, addressing poverty. And we, do have poverty programs such as when I had them growing up, food stamps, not called that anymore, but kind of food subsidy programs, more generally, but also school lunch program, reduced school lunch programs, free lunch programs, etc. So kind of, again, these macro structures, these public policies, decreasing poverty, which will impact students' learning outcomes and student academic success more globally. And effective classrooms and demand a lot from students. They expect them to succeed and work hard to achieve classroom objectives. So kind of this idea, or kind of a criticism of mastery goals, you can imagine someone saying, oh, well, you're just going to, just have them screw around all day and not focus on anything, and thus their achievement levels will be lower. But that's really not what the argument is. It's really an emphasis on learning and the process of learning, and that does not preclude high demands within a classroom wherein students are expected to work hard and succeed, but rather what the focus of the classroom is. And it can be, and continuing on, one important concept here is that fostering an atmosphere of social cohesion rather than kind of this competition where from early on children are taught they're drilled and hyper-focused on grades, and kind of in it, all versus all scenario wherein we're kind of competing in this rat race for X amount of grades and X amount of jobs, really, in society. But researchers found that really fostering this social cohesion where everybody's in this process of learning, we're in this together, we all have a stake in our success as a group, really fosters higher levels of educational outcomes. And this is not surprising because if you come from a wealthier home, you may be familiar with something like Montessori schools or these other schools that don't actually emphasize these to the same level these standardized testing and these like grade hyper focus only on grades, but rather allow a child kind of like to explore or whatever, and their own intrinsic motivations is typically how schools are oriented in higher in schools with wealthier children or children of wealthier parents. Declining levels of achievement in adolescence, in middle school or junior high school, so kind of like 6th to around 9th grade. Expectations for success and self-perceptions of competence decline. Become increasingly concerned about achievement outcomes and reinforcement grades than intrinsic satisfaction in achieving greater competence. Students with more risk factors show a steady decline regardless of their IQ test scores. Higher levels of academic achievement can be promoted by emphasizing a growth mindset throughout adolescence. So kind of the idea here is that over time, children adopt the cultural values of their country. So in a culture that values performance goals, children over time, you see this accumulation effect wherein children adapt those, they internalize those goals. So children become over time less focused on intrinsic satisfaction and becoming more, having higher levels of competence and learning more generally, and become more focused on grades. And also, their expectations of success decline with age. And you can see on the kind of this little chart here is that even in individuals, regardless of their IQ, individuals who are at high risk, that is, they have higher levels of chronic stressors in their life, that can be poverty, overcrowding in the household, various ACEs, as we talked about throughout this course, adverse child events, being associated with declines in their grade point average, regardless of their IQ test score in first grade. So over time, that accumulation of stressors decreasing their GPA, regardless of their initial IQ test score. So what explains those declines? Some argue it's related to an increased capacity to analyze the causes and events in interpreting feedback. Do the effects of purely performance goals educations accumulate in children, and children internalize those cultural values? The educational strategies a culture adopts influence the ways its people think. Schools become, because their schools are more bureaucratized, good grades are more emphasized but harder to come by. Opportunities for choices are limited. Assignments are less intellectually stimulating. Discipline is rigid, all while American adolescents are seeking more autonomy. Giving students a sense of ownership and some degree of control helps maintain their interest and motivation. When teachers require higher level thinking, students rise to the challenge if teachers provide appropriate environments. So kind of the first argument is that children are, over time, kind of this increased cognitive capacity to analyze the causes and effects of things and better interpret feedback, which could allow for more accurate interpretations of their abilities, which can, over time, make them less motivated and have lower levels of self-perceptions of their competence abilities, because now they know that, oh, I've got this this feedback, whether it's grades or kind of just feedback more generally from students and peers or and parents and family members. I now can understand my abilities are actually poor or good, and therefore I will act accordingly. And the next bullet point is really kind of what I was saying before, that over time this accumulation of cultural practices impacts the way that children think. It impacts the way that the particular motivations types and particular learning goals that they acquire over time. Each culture has different cultural values and different learning goals that they emphasize, and then over time those cultural values become adopted at higher rates, and that's reflective and thus in a culture that prioritizes performance goals, you would expect to see performance goals more focused on over time and less kind of focused on mastery goals, on learning, on the process of learning, and on intrinsic motivation. Some argue that because grades are more emphasized with age, so it's not only just an accumulation of the same degree of grade focus, but really the requirements, the emphasis on good grades increases with age at each grade, alongside lower opportunities for children to select what they want to learn and kind of the approaches they want to learn. And because of standardized testing, assignments becoming less intellectually stimulating, but rather kind of just repetition. And all the while, discipline is rigid and more bureaucratic in general. This combination decreases motivation for mastery goals and increases performance goals. Because really, who cares? I just want to get out of here. This whole thing is kind of just a game that I'm playing, and I really don't have any real say in this. I just have to do this thing and then I'm done, and that's all that matters. And studies suggest that giving students a sense of ownership and some degree of control helps maintain their interest and motivation. So allowing students to select what kind of projects they want to work on, in particular checkpoints within a course and within semesters, or in this case 9 weeks if you're in primary school, opportunities for children to provide feedback and kind of allow opportunities to interact with materials that are intrinsically motivating to them, can increase and maintain interest and motivation in education more globally. That is, throughout their educational career, but also within a particular class. Now let's compare achievement cross-culturally, and specifically looking at American students and Asian students. So achievement gaps are rooted in cultural differences of attitudes concerning education and educational practices. Asian Americans are less likely to believe ability is fixed or inborn, and more likely to hold a growth mindset. In one study, two groups of fifth graders were asked to imagine a wizard who would grant them any wish. 70% of wishes listed by Chinese children had to do with education, but only 10% of American kids wished for things related to education. And the most common wish among those 10% of wishes was for less school. When mothers were asked to state the minimum standard to earn performance satisfaction, American mothers gave a number considerably below the level at which they expected their child to perform, and East Asian mothers gave a number considerably higher than the level at which they expect their children to perform. So here you can see different cultural values emphasized in particular countries, in this case China, and kind of East Asian mothers more generally. In the first study of the Wizard study with Chinese and American children, the majority of, first of all, 90% of children did not wish for educational outcomes, and the majority of children who did talk about educational outcomes, they wished for less schooling. So this is kind of, again, this emphasis on learning and education in American culture, as kind of evident by these child's wishes. These educational values are not as emphasized within American culture, and this can be related to these performance goals, wherein over time children just kind of become done with education, and the only thing they can imagine is less education because it's kind of such a grind and so anxiety producing. Or you can imagine children in a poorer neighborhood wherein they're subjected to high security pat downs and just the schools would mold all over them. It's just not a great time. And also the ideas of what performance levels warrant satisfaction are different. So American parents tend to give lower levels of performance expectations to earn satisfaction versus East Asian parents, which expect higher levels of performance. And why might that be? Well, because Asian American, East Asian parents and Asian Americans more generally are less likely to have fixed or inborn ideas about learning, and have higher likelihood of holding growth mindsets. So the idea here is that with time, with practice, through kind of this learning process, you can get better at something. Therefore, you should wish for more education, and therefore my expectations for you are higher because it's possible for you to perform better. And these are all cultural values that exist within that particular setting, within that particular country. And again, those cultural values trickle down to people and affect their behaviors and their approaches to all kinds of particular situations. In this case, interacting with education and their views on education. So a final cross-cultural study that I want to talk about is the spread, is looking at the spread of average math performance in each American school is greater than schools in other countries. So kind of the idea here is we're looking at the average math performance across multiple schools in different countries. What researchers found, in other words, was that there are more similarities among East Asian schools, particularly in Japan and Taiwan, than in the U.S. On average, the students in the East Asian schools perform much better than the American students, I should say, a trend that continues to this day. The cultural differences become even more pronounced as the children continue to participate in their respective educational systems. So kind of this gets back to what I was stating before in multiple slides, is that there are different educational systems for wealthier individuals and poorer individuals. And you can see this reflective in this chart where there's a higher spread. So that is, there are more variability within the data in math scores in this study in American schools than in these Asian schools analyzed in this study. And in general, and on average, I should say, the East Asian schools reviewed in this study perform better than the American schools. And interestingly, is if you look at the average test scores, looking at the same schools in first grade and fifth grade, and the cultural differences in on average math scores become larger with time. And the idea here is that continued participation in those educational systems and interacting with your culture, in general, these cultural values, interacting within these particular environments, those environments being schools and kind of just like the country in general, the cultural differences become more pronounced with age. So it's kind of this accumulation effects of these cultural practices being reflective in the data. And you can see the shift of Taiwan and Japan increasing, and thus creating kind of more distance between the differing schools, the schools within the different countries. So you can see in first grade, the average test score, just kind of making this up, eyeballing it a little bit, for the U.S. schools is something like 12, maybe 12 and a half, versus the average test score in or math performance in China being, I don't know, again, kind of eyeballing this 18, maybe 18, versus in fifth grade, where the average American math test score, again, kind of just looking at the average here, maybe 45, versus in China in fifth grade, something being like 58. So a big jump. You have a difference between whatever it is, 8 points in first grade versus what is that, 45 and 50, greater, 15-ish, something like that. So almost a doubling of the difference over time. And you can also see that little outlier, again, representing the greater spread in average math performance across schools in the United States versus like how condensed the other schools are in the other East Asian schools. Now looking at specific examples of educational programs within the United States, in particular No Child Left Behind and Common Core. The No Child Left Behind Act was a federal legislation signed in 2002 by President George W. Bush. The act compelled states to design school accountability systems based on annual students' assessments in math and reading that were linked to state standards. In 2015, President Obama signed the Every Student Succeeds Act. A study that I wanted to bring into this course was a 2021 Harvard study. And what this Harvard study found, and this came out, I believe, in something like June or July of 2021, the Harvard study found that there are 0 to modest positive effects on student achievement in the targeted subject math and English language arts. Common Core had a negative effect on student achievement in non-targeted subjects, science and social studies. And this negative effect is largest for underprivileged students, exacerbating racial and socioeconomic student achievement gaps. So kind of the idea here is that we're going to have these federal education programs. This was this idea that we're going to have school accountability systems. We're going to we're going to use standardized testing to assess the bad schools, kind of weed out the bad teachers, and then focus on particular skills through standardized testing. Well, the results were just now published, and what they found is basically there were 0 to very modest positive effects on student achievement in the targeted areas of math and language arts. And in fact, it also had a negative effect in non-targeted subjects such as science and social studies. And these negative effects were concentrated in individuals who were already from underprivileged groups, such as lower class individuals in general, and racial minorities. So these macro systems reflect particular educational values and have impacts at an individual level. Integrating work in school. Working students gain knowledge about work, consumer issues, and financial management. Students working 20 hours a week, however, had lower grade point averages, and they were more likely than non-workers to be disengaged from school, and they are more likely to be experiencing psychological distress. And this can be for a host of reasons. Presumably, individuals and students who are, in particular students, I should say, who are working 20 plus hours a week are probably from poorer backgrounds, and thus have other stressors in their life. So now they also have the stress of work, which also takes away from time to perform well in school and also increase other stressors in their life. So really we're seeing this, again, a theme of everything in this class, this accumulation of risk factors impacting particular groups. And in this case, negatively affecting GPA, their GPA, and that is working 20 hours is associated with lower grade point averages for a whole host of reasons. By early elementary school, future dropouts are identifiable by test scores, poor grades, aggressive behavior, lower class, trouble homes, neighborhoods, bullied children, using drugs. Typically not a single factor, but the cumulative effect of multiple comorbid factors. So kind of this idea that all these variables here are kind of naturally co-occurring with an environment. Typically individuals are not from a low class, but don't live in trouble homes or neighborhoods, or don't see drugs in their lives, or don't see any bullying or aggressive behavior. So these kind of variables are kind of naturally occurring with an environment. Thus, it's really difficult to tease apart which particular ones are most contributing to dropping out in high school. So researchers speculate that it's really this accumulation effect of all these factors, placing a child at higher risk of dropping out of school as in high school, I should say. So skipping ahead to achievement in older adults, the level of achievement motivation that we acquire in childhood and adolescence carries in adulthood and influences our decisions and life outcomes. There is no support for ideas that older adults have ceased to pursue goals. Adults' achievement-related motivations are affected by changes in work and family context, shift from extrinsic back to intrinsic, and care more about doing work that is personally satisfying. Older adults who have a stronger sense of purpose and direction have greater physical and psychological well-being. So kind of the idea here is that there's not just this magical stage where you are going to have this new style of motivation once you hit 30 years old. Also, there's no support that older adults stop pursuing goals, but rather the goals shift. And interestingly enough, when given the proper environment to do so, older adults tend to focus more on intrinsic motivating behavior. And that is focusing more on family or just anything that are inner goals to them that they find personally satisfying. And relatedly, older adult having a stronger sense of purpose and kind of direction as an older adult is associated with greater physical and psychological well-being. And finally, literacy, which is the ability to use information to function in society, achieve goals, and develop one's potential. 22% of adults in the U.S. have equivalent to a third grade or lower reading ability. Nearly half of the adults with lowest literacy scores live in poverty. Programs to raise the literacy level of adults are rarely successful in the U.S. There are high dropout rates. Adults who drop out report the program is boring and does not meet their real-life needs. Materials are often geared toward children, not adults with families. So kind of the idea here is that the literacy rates are correlated with class, and the lowest literacy rates are correlated with individuals, or are concentrated within individuals who live in poverty. And programs in the U.S. that emphasize literacy have low success rates, and individuals who participate in this program report that the programs are boring and they're really not meeting the real life needs of the individuals. And this could be because the materials provided to them are kind of something like Dr. Seuss or some childlike materials that are not geared towards adults. And so not only are the materials kind of make you feel bad because it's kind of emphasizing you. By reminding you that you should have these skills, you have the skills of a baby kind of thing. But also it's because these programs are typically boring and they dropouts report and they are not satisfying real life needs. So this kind of goes back to those Milwaukee programs and all these other programs that have been found to be successful, and that is these programs that provide skills to adults, and that targets particular real-life needs for adults are the programs that are most successful in the United States and kind of found globally. And some theorists argue kind of the whole idea of education is to identify problems and motivations found within a particular culture and then design your curriculum around those goals, concerns, those real-life issues. Designing curriculums in those and that way is the best way to foster learning across the world. All right, so that was a long one. Thanks everyone for watching. I'll see you next week, and have a great week. Thanks a lot.